Hey there, welcome back to another video. This time around, it is my review of the 1987 horror film, The Lost Boys. Now, before I share my thoughts on this movie, I want to give another special shout out to Brock for requesting this particular film for me to review. If there's a movie that you'd like to hear my thoughts on or a topic you would like to see me discuss, feel free to donate to my PayPal. The link will be in the video description. So, let's talk about The Lost Boys. The Lost Boys is a film that has a really sizable following, and I get it. It's not my favorite vampire movie, though. There are a few other vampire films I like more than The Lost Boys, like the original Fright Night, Bram Stoker's Dracula, Near Dark, From Dusk Till Dawn. But this is still a really good vampire movie. I think it doesn't really have as much bite as I personally would prefer. I think that the story and the script in particular isn't as deep or as interesting and as captivating as it could be, and I will explain why I feel that way soon enough. I'm not a fan of the climax. I think the climax is really rushed and seems like the screenwriters were on a time crunch and just kind of threw something at the wall and hoped that it would stick. But despite some of my issues with the film, it's got a very distinct and dynamic visual style. It's got some really good performances by a good number of the cast. I love the soundtrack. I think it has some really terrific tracks like Lost in the Shadows, Cry Little Sister, um, and I Still Believe. Good score by Thomas Newman as well. Some really solid special effects in terms of the visual effects work and the makeup effects work by Greg Kinnear, who would actually go on, if I remember correctly, to work on Bram Stoker's Dracula. Uh, and I get why it has an appeal to it. There's some really fun lines of dialogue in terms of one-liners. Death by stereo. uh, and it goes by at a decent enough pace. It's not really that boring, despite the fact that I don't think it's as captivating as it could be. Um, it's a really solid film. I just think that there are some things that are missing that really make it so it doesn't sink its teeth as far into the jugular as it really could. It's directed by Joel Schumacher, the late Joel Schumacher, and before this he did St. Elmo's Fire, and this is one of the first forays that he did with the horror genre, and I think it's really a match made in heaven for Joel. I really like a lot of his horror films, Lost Boys, Flatliners. His visual style, his particular use of gritty, dark, but at the same time really vibrant visuals is perfect for something like The Lost Boys. Um, Joel is a director that, to me personally, as the years will go by, I think he will be appreciated more for his entirety of his catalog for films like The Lost Boys and the stain on his filmography in something like Batman and Robin. I think that will fade over time. I always felt that it was unfair anyway to just straight up judge Joel Schumacher and call him a hack or a bad filmmaker or a bad director because of Batman and Robin. Films like this show that Joel was a terrific filmmaker. He was a great director in his prime. This is a very impressive film when it comes to the visuals. The way he shot the sequences of the attacks when people are pulled right out of their cars and flown into the air. The way that he shot the pier, the way he has the camera floating around and flying as if it's uh, one of the vampires who was holding the camera and showcasing what's going on from their point of view. It also has a very dreamlike and surreal quality to it, and Joel was so good at those kind of films that have this very dreamlike and surreal vibe and feel and tone to it. Does a good job getting a lot of good performances out of his cast and his crew as well, shooting effect sequences and working with Greg Kinnear's makeup, working with the shadows, as well as having the right mix of lighting. But of course, that's a lot of that's a collaboration and not necessarily just a directorial thing. Speaking of collaboration, he worked really well with the cinematographer Michael Chapman, as well as the editor Robert Brown, and whoever was the production designer for the film, and the person who was working on the lighting and all of that. It's a really dynamic and great looking film visually. And a big part of that is due to Joel Schumacher's direction. I mean, even a simple sequence of just a bunch of people riding around on motorcycles through fog is shot in a way that's so unique in terms of the camera angles, in terms of the overall approach, that it has this very different dynamic to it that makes it stand out from a lot of other films that have similar sequences. There's another scene that's really visually striking with I think it takes place in the Lost Boys lair in the cave, and the camera pans out from like one of the characters and really creates a really cool, striking visual. He also handled the action really well, at least the action sequences that really gave him something to work with, to really sink his teeth into. I can't sing enough praises for Joel's direction, and he's also a big part of why the cast came together the way it did, because he was so flexible, and he really was wanting particular people for the roles, and it helped that he had similar interests to Kiefer, or allowed someone like Jason Patric more creative control over the film in order to get them into the fold. The script by Janice Fisher, Jeffrey Boehm, and James Jeremias, based on a story by Janice Fisher and James Jeremias. The screenplay, to me, it's not entirely anemic, but it's not as strong as it could be. I honestly kind of don't even think it's the right blood type, so to speak, for this film in order for it to really live up to its full potential. For one, I don't think there's nearly enough backstory on the Lost Boys themselves. They're the most interesting characters in the movie, and you really don't get to know that much about them at all. I think that's a bit of a letdown, especially the character of David, who was brilliantly portrayed by Kiefer Sutherland. And I really didn't get into the whole romance between Michael and Star. It did nothing for me. I thought it was really rushed and just didn't really resonate on a strong level. I also feel that the character of Michael was kind of weak. I think they really honestly would have been better off showcasing a little bit more of him being a really, fun and nice big brother to Sam. Because there's like one scene, but the rest of the film he's kind of brooding and doing the typical sort of teenage stuff where he's like, I don't need anybody, and, I don't need my mom, and blah, 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 that kind of stuff. And I feel that he was kind of douchey from the start before he even, started to become infatuated by this group of Lost Boys. Also, I don't feel he really fully embraced the Lost Boys, the group, or the relationship between him and David enough. I think it would have been a much stronger story if he actually started to like being a part of this group. And there's bits and pieces of that, but it doesn't really seem like it's really brought to the forefront enough. And some of the other supporting characters, like Laddie, I don't care. Like, why is that character even in the movie? It's pointless. Pointless character. He's essentially dead weight for most of the movie. It's just an excuse to have that sight. I don't think sight gag is the right word, but it's just an excuse to have that twist that, oh, the missing boy in the milk carton is actually a vampire kid. And then you have that sequence where he pops out of the bed, and it's laughable. It's not even like funny in a good way. It's just random and dumb. I never really liked that scene where Laddie pops up through the bed like a jack in the box. At some point during the film's climax, I didn't really care for that scene. And yeah, the stuff with Star didn't really do anything for me. The whole stuff with Michael and Sam's mom, Lucy and Max, I really didn't care, and I don't like the character of Max, and I didn't really think that was needed. I felt that the character of Max took a lot of screen time away, and storytelling moments away from David and the rest of the Lost Boys. I just didn't feel that the stuff with Max was really as interesting or as truly compelling as the stuff between David and Michael, or the stuff involving Michael and Sam once Michael was starting to turn and he's half vampire, and Sam is genuinely scared of his own brother. Also, the Frog Brothers. I wanted more of the Frog Brothers. I wanted more with them, to get to know a little bit more about them and what's going on with their story. I just didn't really care for the stuff with Max, and I know why it's there, but and the twist just was really predictable to me. It wasn't that surprising or shocking. Also, no offense to the actor who portrays Max in the film, Edward Herrmann, but the character just wasn't intimidating at all. Why was he the head vampire? Why wasn't it just David the entire time? Also, speaking of David, I didn't really like the final battle between him and Michael. I thought it was really rushed and weak. It was way too much of the same. And after all this build up and all this, tension to build up to this really climactic final battle between the two, and they just jump in the air, and Michael starts to push David towards, or actually David gets the upper hand first. He starts to push, actually, no, now that I remember, Michael initially starts to push David towards this deer head on the wall, and then David turns the tables and then pushes Michael towards another deer head, and then it ultimately ends in just another push where Michael pushes David into this room of antlers. And I mean, compared to the other death scenes in the film, like the one with the guy who gets knocked into the bathtub full of garlic and holy water and melts and just completely just explodes and then causes blood to just spray everywhere out of all the plumbing, or the guy who got hit with a bow and arrow and had that badass line by Corey Haim, "Death by stereo." Compared to that, weak, really lame. And then the head vampire, I hate the way this climax is, the not necessarily the entire climax, because I really like the stuff with the Frog Brothers and Sam and Michael, fighting the rest of the Lost Boys. I really like that stuff. Death by stereo, the dog getting involved and saving the day, knocking the vampire into the bathtub. Some really good makeup effects in those scenes, and just some really crowd-pleasing stuff. But I don't like the whole stuff with the head vampire. The guy isn't intimidating, very rushed, and he's kicking ass and taking names. It feels inauthentic. And then Grandpa busts through the wall and conveniently sends some wood flying that impales the head vampire and causes him to blow up in the fireplace. And I just, why does Grandpa get that moment? Why isn't it like one of the Frog Brothers or Sam or Michael and the Frog Brothers and Sam together? Why does it have to just be the fucking Grandpa comes in and saves the day out of nowhere randomly? Uh, just randomness. I'm not a fan of that. Um, but despite the issues I have with the script, there's some really clever stuff, like the ways that it messes and twists vampire tropes. I like the comic book sort of stuff, how the Frog Brothers bond with Sam over comics. Um, and I like the whole Lost Boys dynamic with and I love the look of the Lost Boys. The vampires here, it's very different to what vampires were initially portrayed as in films up until the Lost Boys. Um, Definitely have a punk vibe to them, but it works, or a rocker kind of vibe. And that being said, I really think it would have been interesting to play with the Lost Boys stuff a little bit more. Like, they do a good job with the whole peer pressure, dealing with a young man and growing up, and the whole thing of not wanting to grow up and staying young and partying and doing all this forever. But I think it would have been interesting to really play around more with the Lost Boys trope, which is, the whole characters from the Peter Pan stories, where instead of portraying the Lost Boys in this film as just straight up punks, like early in the movie, portray them as heroic figures initially, like the Lost Boys in the Peter Pan stories. And then that makes it understandable that Michael, who's trying to find a place to fit in a new place, in a new town in Santa Clara that he's not used to, and he's at a point in his life where he's really got a lot of questions about himself and what he wants to do. And so he sees this group of guys being heroic and, stopping a woman from being raped, or stopping some drug deal from going down, or saving somebody's life. And he sees that and he's like, that's something that I want to do. I want to be a part of that group. And all the while you're also seeing these shots of people getting carried in the air and flown around by some unseen force. And he joins the group, and it's not necessarily, oh, he's attracted to the girl, because I never really thought that really worked that well. So he's just more attracted to the idea of being a part of something, and a part of something that he initially thinks is good. And then as the film goes along and he spends more time with David and everybody else and gets to know them, and he drinks the blood and everything, and he starts to really enjoy this power that he's got, and he does something heroic himself, and he thinks like maybe he's going to be a hero. But then he sees the real truth one night when he's with them, and they viciously attack a group of people. And then he's like, oh my God, like, this isn't at all what I thought it was. Like, you aren't heroes at all. You aren't trying to do good. And then he finds out the truth, that they're just using that as a cover. You pull the veneer back and you see that they're just vicious animals and ruthless and manipulative. And they put on this veneer of respectability and heroic deeds in order to get people to join their pack. I think that would be really unique and interesting. And instead it's just the same kind of generic, oh, it's just a group of random punks and blah blah blah. And I think that's a missed opportunity. Also, if you had more backstory and character development with these characters, then it might have made things work a little bit more too, as well as more of a bite, because there's a lot of scenes that are, after you see the sequences when people get carried and flown into the air more than once, it starts to really lose its impact, like the second or third or fourth time around. Um, for a horror film, there's not a ton of blood or gore, and I think the film might have benefited from a little bit more of that, a little bit more of the red stuff, especially in some of the attack sequences. Like maybe some severed limbs or something that fall out of the sky too. Like a little bit more variety in that regard. Because it doesn't feel like it has as much bite as it really could as a result. But blood and gore doesn't make a vampire film or a sequence in a vampire film intense just by itself. I mean, prime example of that is in The Lost Boys: The Tribe. Like there are a lot of scenes in that are bloody and violent, but they're fucking terrible because that movie is terrible. But I think it would have been really effective if Joel Schumacher was shooting sequences like that with a little bit more, because one of the most effective sequences in terms of the intensity is the sequence when the Lost Boys are attacking that group of punks who are in a field somewhere, and you have that scene where David bites a guy in the head and blood sprays like crazy out of the top of his head. Like that's one of the most effective horror sequences in the film, other than stuff like, for instance, the idea of all of a sudden just floating up out of your bed and then you wake up and you're looking at the ceiling, that kind of stuff. But other than those kind of things, the horror doesn't really have much of a bite to it. And I feel that in a lot of ways that has to do with the approach of the overall film. Trying to think of other things about the film that are worth mentioning. Of course, the cast. I mean, Corey Haim. This is one of his best roles. I really love his performance here as Sam Emerson. You really feel for this kid, and you definitely could see why Corey Haim would go on to be a much bigger star, at least for a certain period of time after this movie. He and Corey Feldman have great chemistry. And Corey also has really good chemistry with Jamison Newlander. I really love the Frog Brothers. Apparently, Corey Feldman almost did not get this role because he showed up and he was dealing with some drug issues, and he was not really all there initially. And Joel was like, "Hey, if you can't get clean, I'm gonna replace you." And he's like, "No, I really want to do it." And da da da. And Corey wound up getting clean. And got sober enough to be able to do the film. And I don't think the film would be as good or be as memorable as it is without Corey Feldman and Corey Haim. So I really think, that was definitely for the film's benefit and for Corey's benefit to get clean to do this particular role. If you think he sounds like Rambo, that's intentional. That's something that I think Joel Schumacher, one of the other people that were involved with the film, intentionally got Corey to do. Like, had him watch Rambo and some of this other stuff to be like, this is like a kid who, grew up watching action or horror movies, and that's what he views as being heroic. It's also a film that features some other good performances. I mean, other than the two Coreys and Jamison Newlander. I mean, of course, Kiefer Sutherland. Like, I love Kiefer Sutherland's performance in this movie as David. He's haunting. He's charismatic. He's incredibly compelling and powerful. That's a very powerful presence, even though he has barely any lines of dialogue. That just shows you how great of an actor Kiefer Sutherland is. And it's one of the first big roles for him, because he did some stuff before this, like some TV movies. He had a bit part in At Close Range. But I think this is like one of the big roles that really catapulted him into stardom and got him more bigger, meatier roles. And you can definitely see why. Billy Worth had a nice presence about him too, but he had no lines of dialogue. Alex Winter, I can't, still can't, I can, you know, when I see him in this movie, I still see Bill. You know, I still see Bill. I cannot help it. I still see Bill from Bill and Ted. But it was fun to see Alex, and I think he definitely did hold his own here. Um, Edward Herrmann, for the role he was asked to do, he was fine, but I just didn't buy him as a head vampire, and I didn't really care one way or another about his relationship with Lucy. Diane Wiest was fine too for the role she was trying to do, but I think they could have just cut back more on that and given provided more scenes with backstory with the Lost Boys, or more stuff with Michael and what's going on with him, and the dynamic between him and David in particular. Um, Jason Patric, speaking of Michael, his performance is fine. I just think the problem I have with the character has nothing to do with Jason Patric's performance. It has more to do with how the character is written. Uh, and Jamie Gertz, another thing. Good performance by her. I think she did a really good job. I just didn't really care that much about the character. I think that's another issue that really comes down to the screenplay for me. Nothing really to do with Jamie Gertz at all. And Bernard Hughes was fun as Grandpa, but he didn't need that big moment at the end. I don't really think he earned it, to be honest. Uh, Mentioned the score earlier, but I might as well mention it again. It's atmospheric when it needs to be, and it creates the right sense of mood and dread, but then it's also really got this great pace and pulse to it. And in a lot of ways, it's kind of the heartbeat of the movie. Uh, and the cinematography by Michael Chapman, gorgeous, especially the soaring shots of you know, Santa Clara and California, and the place where the Lost Boys live, and just speaking of that, the production and art design, I love the idea of them living in some abandoned hotel that after an earthquake, that became their home because it was forgotten and lost just like they are. Um, Editing by Robert Brown, excellent. There's a lot of tense, really taut sequences. They're really emphasized by the editing. And it's like 98 minutes and goes by at a pretty good pace. It's not particularly that dull or boring, despite some of the stuff that I don't find as interesting as other elements of the story. It's still effective enough in that department that I'm interested to see how things are going to unfold, and how things are going to wind up. Um, yeah, it's a film that I get it. I understand why it has a following. It's enjoyable. It's not as great or as grand or as spectacular as I personally feel it could be, but it's still really good. It's still a really good vampire movie and a really good horror film. At least what, you know, not necessarily the most scariest movie out there, but a really good horror film when it comes to entertainment. You know, it's a really enjoyable film despite some of the issues I do have with it, and it's one of those films that has stood the test of time for the most part. When it comes to the visuals or the makeup effects, and despite the fact that it is also absolutely a product of its time. I mean, there's a sequence that takes place in a video store, but that adds to some of the charm for it, because, you know, some of us kind of want to go back to those days, or we're nostalgic in ourselves for, you know, video stores. So it's kind of fun to see stuff like that in vintage older films like The Lost Boys. It definitely left a mark on people when it came out, and still does to this day. And despite the fact that it's not my favorite and I don't love the movie, I do like it. I do like The Lost Boys. And this is a pretty good Blu-ray. I would love to see this get a 4K release, though. But it's got some good features on it in terms of some documentaries and interviews and stuff like that. Um, but would be nice to see a new transfer. The transfer is fine, but I think it could use a little improvement. But yeah, I really don't know what else to say about the Lost Boys except thanks for watching my review, and as always, I'll see you later. See ya.